Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. I trust that everybody is joining. So this is Unearthing Empire, Food, Land and Colonial Legacies in the UK. We're delighted to have so many of you here today. It's going to be a really captivating conversation. It's so sad that with only an hour, we'll barely scratch the surface of this topic. So I'm not going to keep you for too long, but before I hand over to our two wonderful speakers for today, I'm just going to do a quick introduction and everybody's favorite, the housekeeping. So my name is Roshni Shah. I am the Diversity Outreach Coordinator at Sustain. Sustain, if you don't know, is a powerful alliance of over 100 organizations working together for a better food and farming system. Together, we advocate for food and agriculture policies and practices that enhance the health and welfare of people and animals, improve the working and living environment, enrich society, culture, and promote equity. So this is a 1-hour session. You will have just heard the thing that said it's being recorded. So as a result, we can't allow any external AIs to record, but the video will be shared after via email, and it will be hosted on Roots to Work and Culture Roots Collective websites. I welcome everybody into the room today. Thank you for spending the next hour with us. I'd love to create a space of inclusivity, curiosity, and respect. So please, I invite you to be mindful of different backgrounds when asking questions. Do keep them respectful. In terms of questions, we will have space for Q&A at the end of the session. So please put your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Other participants and attendees will have the opportunity to upvote questions that you like, and we will see that down below. The chat function is disabled for this webinar, but we will be adding in some links, any relevant links into the chat. At the end of the session, we will have a very short feedback survey. It will be super useful to us if you could just take 2 minutes to fill that in. It helps us improve things for next time. And we will be sharing the slides, recording, and any relevant resources after the webinar, so you will get those. So as Diversity Outreach Coordinator, my role at Sustain is broadly focused on helping increase racial diversity across the sustainable food and farming sector, and helping ensure that the sector itself is an inclusive and welcoming space for Black and people of colour to enter. As part of this role, I am proud to have been part of the team that put together cultureRootsCollective.com. So this event is actually being brought to you by Culture Roots Collective. This is a brand new platform for Black and people of colour in food farming and agriculture. The sustainable food and farming sector is not very racially diverse. In fact, the Two Sides of Diversity report noted that agriculture is the least diverse in the UK. And there are many reasons for this, and one of them is representation. You can't be what you can't see. But there are lots of BIPOC, Black and people of colour, thriving in the sector. We realised there was no central place for them to come together, share their stories, their organisations and events. So this website was created it's a collaborative affair with British, it takes me a while to say this, British Veterinary Ethnicity and Diversity Society, BVEDS, AFN Network, Eating Better, and Sustain. And this is a place for us to showcase and celebrate the wealth of BIPOC talent across the sector. We've only just launched very recently, so it's still a work in progress. We would love to add lots more content, but please do check it out. You have a QR code there. And if you would like yourself to be featured on the website, there is also a joining link, which we will be sharing. So yes, this is Culture Roots Collective, everyone. Now, many of us recognize that we are living in a bit of an inequitable food system, with many people relying on food banks without access to good, nutritious food, while farmers struggle to make ends meet, and Black and people of color often feel excluded from the land. What is less widely known is the impact of empire on our current food system. And that's why we are hosting this webinar today, and we have two wonderful experts to tell us more. So today, I would like to introduce you to Corinne Fowler. Corinne Fowler is the honorary professor colonialism and heritage at the University of Leicester. She co-authored the National Trust report on its properties connections to empire in 2020. She is the author of Green Unpleasant Land, Creative Responsive to Rural England's Colonial Connections, and Our Island Stories, Country Walks Through Colonial Britain. She is also co-investigator on the Rural Racism Project, led by Professor Neil Chakraborty, whose reports came out on 1st September 2025. Alongside Corinne, we have Naomi Terry. Naomi is the author of Jumping Fences. This is a research project on the experiences of Black and people of color farmers in Britain, and this was published in 2023 with Land in Our Names, Ecological Land Cooperative, Land Workers Alliance, and Farming the Future. She's currently a community farmer with Sutton Community Farm and Land in Our Names, both in South London. That's our introduction over. Take us to our framing questions, and then I will hand over to Corinne. So we want to talk about today, how has colonialism shaped what we eat, grow, and value? And what is the impact on who has access to land and how power is distributed? Corinne, I hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And I promise to stick to my 10 minutes that I have. I want to talk a bit about my recent work over the last few years, just so that people can get a sense of how my work could possibly resource initiatives or things that they are accomplishing at the moment or want to accomplish. And yeah, we started off with the National Trust report that I did, which really looked into how National Trust houses are deeply entwined with the history of empire. And that's not just transatlantic slavery, although that's a big part of it, but it's also very much East India Company history, and it's not just about wealth, although it is about the influx of imperial wealth, but it's also about people who had roles in colonial administrations and who shaped policy towards empire, both here and overseas. So it encompasses quite a broad diversity of historical scenarios. Anyway, if you could pass on to the next slide. I did some work with young people, which on a project called Colonial Countryside, which was a child-led history and writing project. And we worked with 10 National Trust properties and 100 pupils, mostly from inner city schools across the country. And I just wanted to show an example of some of the work that they'd done, because it's always very much to do with how not just our built heritage was shaped by colonialism, but also our designed landscapes. So here is a poem about Lord Penrhyn, whose descendants built this castle, neo-Gothic castle, with slavery wealth from Clarendon plantations in Jamaica. And one of the pupils, actually the second from the right there, wrote this poem about Lord Penrhyn. He had money, I had history. His money bought my history. you know, really, really powerful about how history is told and so on. And so with all of my work, especially sort of where I am now, I'm really interested in resourcing this conversation with an historical dimension, and to think what exactly the colonial history of the countryside is. So next slide. A lot of what we know so far and what's most familiar to the public is not just National Trust houses, but now, but the history of ports like Liverpool and Whitehaven, and how these were important, you know, slavery ports, but also connected to products like sugar, and in what the case of Whitehaven, tobacco. And less known perhaps is another layer of history, which is that some of these places were, for example, Whitehaven, were more multicultural in the past than they are today. So it's really, really important to remember that the countryside in the 18th century was particularly multiracial because of all this colonial activity, especially along the coastlines, but also in the deep rural. So if we move on to the next slide. One of the themes of my work has been enclosure and this kind of slow privatization of land, which happened over a number of centuries, but which escalated and speeded up during the colonial period when there was an influx of colonial wealth. So what enclosure did, as you probably all know, is it effected a transformation from peasant farming to capitalist farming, but also from small holding to large-scale land ownership. And of course, from subsistence to wage labour. So all of those things, it's very, very important. But the missing piece in the jigsaw is that a lot of this land was enclosed by people with colonial wealth, and using colonial wealth in order to enclose fields and throw people off the common land where they'd graze their cattle, or collected gorse for burning, or flagstones for building, and so on. So the important to remember that enclosure is also a colonial story. It's not just a domestic story. Next slide. So with that in mind, I designed 10 walks through rural Britain to open up this forgotten history of empire. I don't really like the term hidden history, but that's my publisher's choice, really. And on the right is one of the people that I walked with. So I had walking companions who really talked to me about what this history means to them, what these landscapes mean to them. So I'll come back to Graham Campbell there in a moment. So next slide. So on this map, you can see how widely dispersed my walks are from Jura, the Isle of Jura, because lots of the Scottish Isles were entirely bought with colonial wealth, especially East India Company wealth, but they've also got sugar wealth connections, and then all the way down to Cornwall. Some of these walks are on the Atlantic side, Atlantic facing coast as well. So next slide. One of the walks I'll just mention briefly to give you a sort of flavour of the sorts of histories that emerge from this research is the history of enclosure, as I've already mentioned. The walking companion for this walk was a DJ and broadcaster called Zacchaeus Sewell, and we walked together on this route, which is outlined there from Bungay on the border with Norfolk and Suffolk, all the way back in a circular walk around the common there. So next slide. And what I did really there was put together things which aren't normally put together. So the Legacies of British Slavery database, which shows up where the slavery wealth was coming from and who it was coming to, and to an extent how it was spent, with local enclosure maps. And so you can see I've highlighted here an entry on Sir William Wyndham Dalling, who owned the house in question, Ersham Hall, and you can see Dalling's name on this enclosure map. So if you pass the next slide, all I want to say about this, really, I won't go into details, is just that this land was enclosed with slavery wealth, and it extended to the local commons where, as I say, people were eking out their livelihoods that they had access to, and suddenly they weren't even allowed to collect firewood. So this had a really big impact, and also people lived there. So some of the discourse that was evoked by the Enclosure Act, which relates to this particular property and expansion of the estate, because so many country estates were expanded using colonial wealth and profits. The language that was used was that this was wasteland, that it was useless wasteland. And we know now, in hindsight, that this wasn't wasteland at all. But it was very much the kind of discourse that was active in the colonies as well, as justification for stealing land that belonged to everyone, or that was used by Indigenous people in the case of the colonies. And hope I'll come back to that a little bit later. So next slide. Thank you. Yeah, I just thought I'd mention very briefly Graham Campbell, who is a councillor in Glasgow City Council. He has been for a long time, and he asked me if we could walk on the Isle of Jura, so we did. And what he wanted to do was to search for the story of his relatives. His name is Campbell. There are many Black Campbells in Scotland. They say there are more Campbells in Jamaica than there are in Scotland. And that's because of the colonial connection and the slavery history associated with the Campbell clan, because slavery was a very clannish affair. And that meant that because of the way in which the plantation records were kept, there was no way that Graham could find out what happened to his ancestors in the same way that an aristocratic family in Britain today will be able to trace what everybody did, who everybody was. So we went in quest of that. So what I'm trying to say is that this history is really personal and meaningful on that level. And then just the last couple of slides. One is, I just wanted to mention, it was mentioned in the introduction, we just brought out 3 reports as a result of an in-depth study we've done on how racism uniquely manifests in the countryside. And hopefully that some of you will be able to use that as a resource. It's an important new piece of evidence. And finally, the last slide. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that there are lots of really, really interesting projects that I think could be taken further. This one is an example of Sharpham Hall, which is a mindfulness centre, but they are interested in opening up the land which has a colonial history to those who need it most. And I think there's lots of scope for a kind of reparation in that respect, given all this history. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Corinne, for that. You've given us a little bit of the historical context. Now, Naomi is going to take us to today and talk about experiences of people working on the land in the UK today. I'll pass it over to Naomi.
Thank you, Roshni, and thank you so much, Corinne, for laying out that historical perspective. It's a little bit I'm aware that it's a bit windy where I am, so I'm going to trust you, Roshni, to interrupt me.
Sounds okay. Sounds okay.
Yeah, okay. It will probably take me 30 seconds to move if I do need to, so just let me know. That's but yeah, so a couple of years ago now, we published this report called Jumping Fences that was about land, food and racial justice in British farming. And you can see the collaborators on the screen there: Land Workers Alliance, Land in Our Names, Ecological Land Co-op and Farming the Future. All really interesting organizations to get to know if you're interested in this kind of realm of either getting into land work yourself or more interested in the justice side of things. And the aim of this research was to try and understand the experiences of Black and people of colour that are working in land work. So you can see actually on the front cover of the report, there's this guy called Alexander Thompson Bayer, who's a crofter in Scotland. So he's currently in that picture harvesting seaweed, but also works as a farmer in that area, and probably is the only well, I'm sure is the only black crofter on that island in North Uist. So what does it feel like to be in that position? What does it look like and what does it feel like was kind of some of the guiding questions. Next slide. So yeah, and the starting point, as Roshni explained, farming is the least diverse occupation in the UK. So trying to build an understanding as to why that is, and then also to understand the experiences for people that are going into it. And there's a wealth of research and sort of interventions, and so this field in the US is quite much, it's a lot further advanced, and sometimes we end up recycling the kind of environmental justice movement of the US and trying to apply it into our actually quite different context in the UK. So wanting to kind of build the research that's happening here. And yeah, there's a lot of environmental and farming organizations that are, you know, turning their mind to equity and racial inequity, especially in the wake of George Floyd and everything that was happening maybe about 5 years ago. Yeah, and past research was demonstrating a prevalence of rural racism. Really excited to hear about Corinne's report and look forward to having a look at that. And yeah, access to land for marginalized groups is hampered by land accumulation and wealthy estates, and many of them have colonial ties, which does make a case for some form of reparation. So I work as a community farmer, and over the past sort of 5 years, we've seen a real upsurge of community gardens in big cities like London, which is great. And obviously those cities are where most BIPOC people live. And you see people growing vegetables in the most marginal spaces. So there's definitely a desire there. And there is also a lot of knowledge there, because a lot of people coming from, for example, migrant backgrounds will be coming from a more recent practice of agriculture in their families compared to here in the UK. But is it really necessary for people to be growing on such marginal spaces when there is actually a lot of unused or underused good agricultural land around the country? So that's kind of a question that Lion have really been turning their mind to as well. Next slide. So yeah, in that research project, we were kind of trying to look across more of the UK, but as you can see by those little yellow dots, all the participants that I spoke with, there's still like a big gap in the north. And we didn't go to Ireland or Northern Ireland at all. But yeah, we had a bit more of an understanding of the experiences of people living in London because of the Roots into Food Growing report, which came out a year or two preceding this one, that was more focused on like London BIPOC food growers. So yeah, I wanted to kind of understand what it's like in more rural spaces. Next slide. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings.
Yes, sorry, you're just halfway through.
Thank you. So yeah, if you want to read more detailed sort of stories from the people that I spoke with, there is actually an appendix to the report that's available on Lion's website. I'm going to share just some of like the stories that people that I spoke with to try and like bring their voice into this discussion a bit more. Next slide, please. So yeah, these are some of the things that came out. Different forms of isolation. Everyone experienced some form of isolation, and sometimes it was in quite traumatic or sort of violently racist ways. Structural racialization, so the processes of marginalization occur in a very systemic way, and I think a lot of this is to do with the kind of perceived image of what a farmer looks like and how that can play into an individual's own experience of trying to make a way in that, and maybe feeling like an outsider or being perceived as an outsider and that they don't belong. Healing and social justice, so practicing the work of food growing as a source of healing and social justice. Individuals are motivated towards bringing about diversity and justice within the farming sector. there are really complex relationships to profit and land ownership. People trying to work in ways that are sustainable, but and that they can derive a livelihood from, but that also have a lot of values. And yeah, I guess, you know, we're all living within quite a capitalistic framework that isn't necessarily geared towards agroecological farming. And yeah, I've mentioned the pervasive societal narratives around who farming is for and what it looks like. And a lot of people I spoke to, their experience were also compounded by other dimensions of their identity, such as gender and ability and class. Next slide. Next slide. Let's skip over that one. So this is Flavian Obiero, who's a pig farmer and he came to the UK from Kenya and wanted to work as a farmer, and just went knocking on people's doors basically until he found somebody that would hire him. And he said, and he's quite defiant really, he said, well, if Black people and people of color can live here, then why can we not farm? Next slide. Sel Robertson is a really successful flower grower, and she says, I don't think it's something as easy as, you know, giving everyone money to go on a bursary or something. It's like that relationship with my family. If there was a higher status applied to horticulture, then it wouldn't have been so much of an issue. So here Sel is kind of responding to, I guess, like programs that are more geared towards fixing representation with quite simplistic actions in the sector, and that there's really a deeper culture shift that's needed in order to make the sector more receptive and more welcoming for people of color, as well as you know, yeah, providing bursaries and like very tangible material forms of access. Next slide.
We just got 2 minutes left.
Oh no. Okay, well okay, well, yeah, we'll keep going. So Kumar is a sheep farmer. He was a sheep farmer and now is a vegetable farmer. And he speaks towards the way that he just sort of tried to make everybody else feel comfortable. It's very white dominated. I think it was up to me to integrate with them, and I did that. And then farming became easier. I made the effort to make them comfortable. So that was quite a common sort of thread. Next slide. And then I wanted to share what Diego said. So here are some of the recommendations that came out of the report, but I'll just read what Diego said about his experience of getting into farming as a teenager. So in his life, people were always outdoors and always outside, playing, barbecuing, at family functions. My father was always proud to bring those traditions with him and to implement them. I guess what he would consider his new village or his friends and family. And that's what rubs off on me, being outdoors and helping people. But I looked around and I saw no one doing anything different other than the typical jobs, being a musician or being a football player. I looked at that and I said, I want to do something different, completely different. And then of his experience in agricultural college, he says, if you don't have thick skin, you won't survive. If you don't have confidence in yourself, you won't survive it. People would say to me, aren't you supposed to be just rapping? What are you doing farming? You're wasting your time on farming. That was mentioned to me a lot of times when there was like, no, you shouldn't be doing this. Why are you wasting your time? And I was doing a lot of explaining, sort of trying to bridge the gap and meet people halfway and really go into the world. That's where you have to have thick skin. So it's just sort of a lot of effort that somebody who's just trying to make their way in farming has to go to just to exist in that space. Yeah, next slide. And then I just wanted to touch briefly on, next slide again. So can you just click through maybe sort of 6 times until all these pictures come up? So prior to my work on jumping fences, I was doing some research around, one more click, understanding the kind of cultural dynamism that exists in our world and a kind of like a diversifying impact of globalization that is perhaps different to the kind of homogenizing impacts of globalization that have had a really negative impact on our food system. So I'll just finish up with this slide, telling you about the experience of Aisha, who's a participant that I I spoke with from London, from Sierra Leone. And just to kind of give you an idea of how all these different things have woven a web in this one individual's life related to food and relating to farming. She says that the UK is a multicultural society, but the way that we dress, the way you prepare your foods, and your language defines more or less who you are. It gives you that sense of this is a Sierra Leonean thing. So this summer, or this would be probably 5 summers ago now, on top of her work as a health practitioner, Aisha is part of the COVID-19 rapid relief team, delivering food and taking care of at-risk people in her local community. Many are from West African countries like herself. Due to import restrictions, she's not able to source all the ingredients for the rich cassava leaf plasters that people crave. So she's making simple fried dishes. These use a different oil that's better for cholesterol anyway. As a diabetes nurse, she thinks about the different fats in the food she prepares for her family and community. So now she uses less palm oil. Aisha's children prefer the British food that they eat in school, but she still has kept cooking Sierra Leonean food, and they like her sticky soup the best, a slippery okra stew. She wants them to have a taste for the spicy, rich food and the knowledge of how to prepare it. If her daughter marries another West African in the future, she will need to know how to cook, or the mother-in-law may think badly of Aisha. A large calabash, which is in the top left there, which is a bowl carved from a large gourd, was given to Aisha and Henry on their wedding day in Sierra Leone. Aisha still uses the bowl to prepare rice on special occasions, as it gives her a feeling of belonging. Inside the calabash are placed the bride price and the ceremonial cola nuts. Aisha used to be an agronomist and grew food for her family using only natural fertilizers and no pesticides. Now in central London, she still experiments on her balcony with growing maize seeds from varieties she has brought back from Sierra Leone and showing her children how to plant and tend to them. So yeah, I just wanted to end on that story that I think kind of illustrates the systematic nature of all of these things and how that plays into one person's life. It's very sort of we're all really connected globally in what we eat. A lot of the decisions are beyond our control. And yeah, this isn't an unfamiliar story for a lot of BIPOC Londoners.
Thank you, Naomi. We're gonna
yeah.
have to finish up if there's anything else, or
no, that's great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, and it was really lovely to hear that story. Oh, sorry, I need to stop sharing. Great, thank you. We're going to move on to some questions now. I have a few questions here, and then we'll be able to take any questions that we have from the participants. If you have any, please do put them in the Q&A down below. So we've discussed that the empire has had a wide-ranging impact on food systems here and abroad. Abroad, we've on farming systems, wiping out indigenous crops, reducing the nutritional value of food that is grown, which then affects the health and the wealth of populations. A reduction of food access has also been seen here in the UK, with BIPOC people not only excluded from farming, but as mentioned in Jumping Fences, experiencing more health inequalities. Black families are disproportionately vulnerable to food insecurity here in the UK, and this has a knock-on effect on health impacts. And there are kind of many more examples of this kind of thing that we don't have time to go into. I want to ask what reparations might look like then within a food system context.
Yeah, shall I jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously land ownership is connected umbilically with food systems. I was thinking in response to this question a little bit about CARICOM, the group of 20 Caribbean nations and member states who have called for reparations, and they've got this 10-point plan. And they're very interested in the impact of empire on food systems, land and health, obviously. And so, I mean, two of the things that they call for are an Indigenous peoples development program. So the point that they make is that because the Caribbean was deliberately held back from development in order to serve the European nations and consumers and commercial interests, there, you know, that land grab went alongside. Yeah, I mean, a form of genocide, but also the importation of illnesses and disease with Europeans. And so the population of Indigenous people in the Caribbean region was reduced from 3 million to 30,000 by the turn of this century. And so of those people, that so many are landless and marginalized. But the other point that they make is that there's a need to address poverty and chronic disease as part of sort of reparations. So in terms of the Caribbean, again, but also in Britain today, the African descended population in the Caribbean and beyond has the highest instance of diabetes type 2. And it's all connected to the history of slavery because of the historical diet, the replacement of the food that people were eating with a kind of sugar-rich diet combined with the physical demands of plantation work means that people develop diabetes type 2, and that's hereditary, so it's been passed down through generations, and obviously there's a need for reparation there through health support and so on. But I suppose I'd also go back to my final slide and say that actually the land ownership is a massive issue here, especially that which was acquired with colonial wealth and involved huge exploitation of various kinds, which was unseen, went on elsewhere off stage. But the people who are inheriting these lands, are often either unwilling to talk about that history or unaware of it. And there is a need to give over land or open up land which is underused to those who need it most. And of course, there is a sense in which the land can offer some repair for the harms of racism and so on. So, yeah, I mean, I'd just point in that direction, really, in my answer.
Thank you, Corinne. And I don't know, I've always also I've come across the fact that South Asian people are disproportionately affected by type 2 diabetes as well as a result of all the famines during colonial times. So it's wide-ranging.
Wide-ranging, good
Yeah.
points, yeah.
Naomi.
Yeah, I think that with this question, one thing that I want to draw attention to is like just imagining the sort of world that you want to live in. What world do I want to live in? I want to live in a world where everybody can get involved in food growing actually, and where everybody has access to space to do that. And the landscape can sometimes be quite fraught, and we live in quite polarized times. And so when it comes to reparations, there's a question for me of like what forms of repair are necessary for us to live into that world. It's not going to happen overnight, and like part of that healing is about healing of relationships, and there is, I think for a lot of people, there exists a big element of justice in that and what is fair. So there is a material element, and there is, in this country especially, a redistribution of land that's called for. And there are landowners that are trying to figure out ways of allowing themselves to do that. And that can be a really complicated process. Relinquishing power probably isn't that easy. And yeah, so I think there are various groups within the kind of land and farming sector that are trying to work on that side of things. And there's people that are inheriting land that are just sort of saying like, why have I got this land? I don't know what to do with it, or I don't really deserve it, or it's not really where my life is at now. It's just something that history has passed down to me. And then the kind of the beyond the material, I definitely like mirror that idea around healing as a form of repair. And like as a farmer, I do find like my work with soil and being outside and working in nature really restorative and really healing. Being able to grow nutritious food for myself, my family, my community, it's like a really powerful form of repair.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think
and also there is a definition of how lie and land in our names, who work very strongly with the idea of reparation, and we've got a definition on our website as well, that is worth checking out.
We'll share that afterwards. Thank you very much. Got lots of questions coming in. I'll try and get through mine quickly. So one of the reasons that the British felt emboldened to colonize land was because they did not respect indigenous methods of farming. They saw it as wasteland, as Corinne mentioned earlier. Therefore, land grabbing became a tool of domination. The superior colonial attitude meant that local knowledge was disregarded. Even though now we are often returning to those like traditional practices and not necessarily also giving credit to their sources. Please, could you expand a little bit more on your knowledge of this cultural imperialism? And just maybe some more examples.
It's all wrapped up, in brief, it's all wrapped up with notions of civility and barbarity. And what was quite common in the colonies was this perceived laziness of the people who were there already when the British arrived. And yet a lot of what that expressed was a kind of reciprocal relationship with nature and a more advanced and conscious relationship with land where biodiversity was supported and so on. Again, all in hindsight. And then, you know, from there, we kind of entered into ideas of land improvement through mass farming and the notion of wasteland and empty land that I've spoken about in relation to enclosure, which allowed the history of mass farming. But there's also the issue of indigenous knowledge about the land being written out. So the story of quinine is a really good example of that, and the cinchona trees from Ecuador, which were then that indigenous knowledge about how quinine was a great treatment for malaria, actually allowed the expansion of the British Empire. But what was done was that knowledge wasn't acknowledged, and the explorers and scientists presented these as their own discoveries, and then they then grew red bark plantations, and it became a big commercial asset. So the people who've initiated that knowledge had no share in that pharmaceutical success, in inverted commas.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I would add on that is just kind of thinking about like how the big sort of agri-corps expanded genetically modified crops so that they could sell their seeds and sell their pesticides and sell their fertilizers, and how that's still very pervasive in the way that we grow food today, especially in colonized countries like throughout Africa and also in India as well. Big companies like Monsanto, and that was a product of war as well. All of those chemicals that they were trying to sell were sort of from chemical warfare, needing to find new markets to sell those products. And then now we're finding that actually, it's not a great idea to farm in that way. So needing to go back to those old ways. And unfortunately, I think one of the insidious sort of things that can arise from that is like having stripped those indigenous communities or traditional groups of that knowledge and force them to use these new seeds and force them to use these new methods. And now that knowledge has been eroded from those communities, and then now you kind of see a new wave of things like permaculture arising, where we're actually trying to like spread more soil friendly ways of farming, for example, or kind of it's like rebranded as regenerative farming. And you might have kind of like people that are from people teaching back the knowledge to the people that have been stripped of that, or the descendants of those people that have been stripped of that knowledge. And yeah, that's just, yeah, where we're at.
Thank you. Like about 10 minutes left and loads of questions from the audience. So I'm going to try and get through many of these as I can. The most upvoted one is, how does this link to the campaigns for better pay for farmers? I'm very aware a lot of people use, like their wealthy families, etc., to be able to take the very low wages of being a new entrant farmer. Naomi,
yeah,
that's
it's a really challenging
area.
space. It's like as I was saying, it's not like in the trying to farm within a capitalistic system, it's not an easy job, an easy line of work to go into. And I think that you know, everyone deserves a living wage, and that's not the case for a lot of farm work. This can be very exploitative. So I think like campaigns like the universal basic income for farmers, which is going to roll out a trial of that, I think, in London soon. That's really exciting and really important in terms of access for people from marginalized groups, because yeah, it can feel really, really unrealistic or just not at all aspirational to go into a sector where you're going to be underpaid and overworked. It's not appealing. And also probably not something that we should be encouraging people to do.
And then we have a question here about, can you speak on the importance of seed banks within protecting cultural farming practices?
Yeah. So a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the culture that is part of agriculture is like very strongly linked with the genetic material, the seeds, and also the landscape that those seeds come from. And when you separate all those things, and the seed becomes separated from the knowledge, becomes separated from the landscapes, they all start to kind of fall apart. And it's really important that we have these kind of like place-based knowledges, place-based seeds. So seed banks are really important for preserving that. And like really sad news this summer when Palestinian seed bank was destroyed, because they have such a rich, long history. They have been, in the face of all of this and like everything that's happened there, they've been able to preserve their agricultural practices and the knowledge and the seeds. And yeah, having a seed bank destroyed is really terrible. But some of those seeds, I think, were saved in other locations because of that threat having existed for such a long time. And yeah, I think yeah, hopefully that gives a little bit of a
Thank you.
Go on.
Unless Corinne, you have something to say, I'll move on to the next question. Could either or both of you say more about some of the racialized and class differences between farmer owners and farm workers, and how these track into the historical accumulation of wealth? Maybe Corinne, you want to start with that, or?
I'm trying to look for the question. It's quite a big question.
I think often like the farm owner is considered to be the landed person, and the person that's sort of maybe benefiting financially from the farm, and the farm worker is considered to be kind of like a labourer. I think in like the agroecological sector that I work in, it's less relevant now. I mean, I'm one of the head growers at this farm in Sutton community, and we rent our land anyway, so it's owned by the council. So yeah, I don't think that it's so relevant anymore in that sector. But I'd say in more like conventional farming, where government subsidies have a big part to play, it's normally the landowner that is receiving those subsidies. And yeah, so that system doesn't really support the kind of farming that I think the world that we want to live in would require.
Yeah, and all I'd add is just a historical perspective that I don't know if anyone's read William Cobbett's Rural Rides from the 1820, but he went round on horseback making observations. One of the things he said was that the landed gentry were being replaced by colonial figures who were increasingly becoming landowners and kind of implanted themselves in the whole structure as magistrates, local law enforcers, local lawmakers, local magistrates, MPs, and so on, and sort of very much working in their own interests. And you know, there are many famous cases of, for example, the Tolpuddle martyrs who tried to form a union, an agricultural workers' union, and were sent off to one of the British colonies. And so, you know, it's always interesting to remember these things, and also to remember that there is a history of black farmers in the 18th century, 19th century, and also Tudor black farmers as well. Just to remember that this is not a recent phenomenon.
Yeah. I think it's also, just to add there, I feel like it's in current times can be a way of trying to denigrate somebody or trying to put somebody down by calling them I don't know, a farmhand rather than a farmer. And that, you know, one of the participants that I spoke to in Jumping Fences said that somebody said to them, like, oh no, to be a farmer you have to own the land. And yeah, I mean, it's just language really, but it can be used in quite insidious ways. And then also maybe just to bring in the kind of aspect of our food system in the UK that's beginning to mirror more and more what happens in the US with migrant labor. And there've been a number of cases of people that have arrived to the UK on farm agricultural working visas for seasonal work, and left in really terrible living conditions, being underpaid because they're for different reasons, and kind of sort of entering into kind of modern day indentureship. And yeah, that's happened this year a couple of times up in Scotland and also in the southwest.
Thank you for sharing, and it's worth also pointing out that often why migrant labourers come to this country to seek work is because of what has been destroyed in their own lands, often by like modern day imperialist actions. I just comment that's why we are using BPOC instead of global majority, which is more accurate. And yes, I agree. We have tended to use BPOC more because it is more widespread, and I think we are trying to introduce that more that terminology more into how we talk. So thank you for highlighting that. We will continue to do that going forward.
I think also though it's just it's language, and there's just I mean, there's so many. Some people feel really comfortable with the word BAME. Some people really don't feel comfortable with that. Some people feel really comfortable with BPOC. Some people feel more comfortable with BIPOC. And I agree with the term global majority being very appropriate. But I think that conversation can actually sometimes be a distraction from the more important conversations that we need to have, is my opinion.
I'd only add that it is quite useful because of the interrelated nature of land and food systems, to think globally in that way. So it's a terminology that particularly fits this conversation because of all these things which are connected.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left. I just wanted to move to kind of looking forward. Two questions, I think. Any examples of practical models for shared access or ownership of land? And then I wanted to talk about how we can honor the roots of our food history, because so much of the food that we eat and value today here, traditionally British, comes from a melting pot of cultures, from like tea to like spices we use in our food to fish and chips, etc. So yeah, if we could just cover those two questions in 2 minutes, that would be amazing.
The Ecological Land Cooperative have a community farmland toolkit that's really helpful if you're considering community ownership, and it talks you through, it provides loads of resources and very practical information on things ranging from finances to governance to land access. Yeah, so I'd recommend looking at that if that's something that you're interested in.
I know that there's a scheme by the Linbury Trust, which is all about opening up land to people who need it most.
And yeah, I think that a lot of landowners are trying to figure out ways of transferring land into community ownership. but yeah, there's a lot of kind of, I think there's a lot of feelings tied up with that if you're taking land out of out of a family, and sort of stuff around trust building, that it's going to be stewarded well and that it will be held in perpetuity, and sort of good practice.
Oh, and in Spain, they've got something called the La Bolina project, which builds relationships of trust between refugees and rural communities. And there's it's a kind of regeneration.
How do you spell that?
LA, and then Bolina, Bolina, and it regenerates degraded landscapes through permaculture, and it's all about dignified, healthy livelihoods as well.
And then speak to your other question, Roshni, about kind of like the diversity of foods in our on our plates and where they actually come from. I find that a really reconnecting practice, because I think the aesthetic of what like a traditional English garden looks like can be quite misleading. Like, for example, your tomatoes and potatoes and all of those things coming from Latin America, and actually quite a lot of the traditional English vegetables that we grow are from Latin America. Basil is from Africa.
I learned last week that cucumber is from India, or the foothills of the Himalayas.
And the same, I find it really helps to reconnect me with the work that I do here as a farmer. It's quite strange when you start to really get into it, but it can be quite wonderful. And I think it's quite similar actually to how I felt sort of reading your book, Corinne, about the 10 walks through Britain, and learning about all of those connections, and learning about like what the truth of the matter really is, and revealing everything, and peeling off the layers of obscurity that have been put upon us by our education system, and a vision of the empire that kind of like lies across the surface of everything. You start to peel back the layers, and it's actually just really interesting. It's kind of fascinating, and some of it is quite violent, but also most of it's just really interesting, and it can help really, I think, ground those of us that have arrived here through pathways of migration. It can really, really ground us and make you realize like you really, really belong here, and you really belong in this work, and it doesn't belong to white Englishmen.
And the out of placeness is actually a misplaced belief in the first place. And I was thinking a little bit about what you were saying about fairness. The irony of the English saying that their core value is fairness when you look at colonial history. I mean, I don't know where to start. And also, getting to the English country garden, if you deconstructed that, it would, it points you in all directions all over the world. So education is vital because of the colonial commercial routes through which our food has been transported and introduced. There's so much for children to learn about, and adults, about the history of breadfruit and how that came from Tahiti, and it was used as cheap food for enslaved people, and then became sort of part of the diet, and things like gingerbread and from ginger imported from Jamaica that you can find in the Lake District, or rum butter, which comes from the distilleries in the Caribbean. There's so much. You mentioned cucumber. There's so many things that we need to learn about. Just virtually everything we eat has got one of those kind of stories behind them.
Yeah, so I'm seeing the importance of like education and bringing people together to talk about their cultures, eat together. One of the reasons why I am drawn to food and why I love love working in this sector is that food is the one thing that connects us all as humans. And, that's something really powerful there, and something we often forget. We seem to have lost Naomi temporarily, which is probably a good time to just bring this session to a close. I would like to say thank you. Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen and talk at the same time, which doesn't work. I'd like to say thank you to you, Corinne, and to Naomi, both for your session today. It's been super interesting. I wish we had 3 hours about this, but we don't. we're going to put the link to our survey in the chat. So if you could fill that in, that would be amazing. And there you go. Hopefully, am I sharing my screen? Yes. Yeah. And yeah, if you want to check out cultureRootsCollective.com, roots2work.com, we will be hosting the videos there. And if you have any other questions, you can get in touch. My personal email is roshni.shah@sustainweb.org. I will be sending you a follow-up email. And that is it. It's 2:00. So I think I'm going to have to let everybody go, but just thank you again today. Corinne, I don't know if you'd like to say any final words.
No, we'll let people go, but I'm really interested in what's in the chat. It's a very rich conversation.
Yeah, we'll share these. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all. We can say goodbye now. Bye-bye.